different traits in organisms. So we can look at the other mechanism that they like to say does the deed, which is mutations and natural selection and time. You put them all together. But I am not aware of any good mutations. And if there are any good mutations, they're usually offset by the bad traits that happen with the same mutations. And so you got a duck with 3 legs. You know what he does with that third leg? It looks like it's perfectly functioning, but he just drags it behind him. He doesn't do anything with it. It's not a useful property. And I have a cat that looks just like that, and we call him Paws. He has extra fingers, and it doesn't help him. He actually trips up on those things. And nobody wants to have genetic mutations. Mutations are not conducive to sexual reproduction. They invoke pity, and they're harmful. Even with natural selection, if you happen to get one good trait, you'd still have that offset by all the bad traits, and you'd have to like take over the population, because all the other people in the population would have the unmutated genes, and so it wouldn't be useful to anybody. Mutations are the official mechanism for evolution right now. But evolutionists speak as though the traits are developed by environmental pressures, and Lamarckism still has the emotional support for the theory of evolution. Here's an argument against theistic evolution. Meiosis is where the cells divide into half a chromosome, and that's how you get different kids. You have 3 kids, and they all look different. It's because of meiosis. This only happens in sexual reproduction. But you ask yourself, if a cell's dividing, why doesn't it just continue dividing the way it's done for eons? Why would it start doing sexual reproduction? That doesn't make sense. Why would a cell do that at all? And it's kind of a coincidence, too, when you think of all the different things that have to happen with sexual reproduction. Like the mammal would have to grow breasts, and the baby of the mammal would have to know how to use the breasts, and all. I mean, there's hundreds of things that have to happen for sexual reproduction to work. Every one of them have to. I mean, you talk about irreducible complexity. This is a lot of different things that have to happen. So even if God sparked the first cell, you'd still have to intervene several times more, especially in sexual reproduction. So history has something to say about catastrophe and genetic traits too, but you'll have to read my book for that. Well, paganism is everywhere, from Greece to Rome, Germanic gods, Africa, Asia, Australia, Americas, even Hawaii. Paganism was everywhere back in the beginning. Why? I'm not going to tell you. Just kidding. All right, there are similarities in paganism. Each pagan religion had its own traits, but there are similarities. They were all polytheistic, which means there were lots of gods in each one. The gods all had stories about their birth and how they came to power. The gods were often personifications of human abilities and things of nature. And this is especially true of gods throughout the Mediterranean. And we have lists that link gods from one region to a god of another region. Often the only noticeable variation is the name. So you can see an example of gods going across language barriers in the days of the week. The week is almost always 7 days. It's almost always corresponding to 7 gods. You start with Sunday, which is the sun's day, or Apollo, Solus. And through history, after Jesus came, a lot of them changed it to the Lord's Day because of his resurrection. Our language still uses sun. Monday is Moon's Day. And Tuesday is the Mars, god of war. It's just the Norse name for the same god. Wednesday was for Woden, which was the Norse god for Mercury. And Thursday is Thor's Day, which in Latin is Jupiter. It's kind of interesting that you can correlate these gods from Norse to Latin. Thunor was the god of thunder, the Norse god. And Friday is like Venus, the Germanic goddess. Frigg, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's good enough. And then Saturn's Day. A lot of languages use Sabbath. So the days of the month are obvious, right? You have 30-day lunar cycle. And then the days of the year is a solar cycle, 365 days. And they keep trying to correlate the lunar and solar cycles and add different leap years and things like that. The Hindus have a 7-day week. So you kind of wonder, if the names were borrowed from each other, then why was Saturday the only name that came from the Latin? When all these Latin gods were around a long time, the Germans had their own names for the same gods. And actually, many royal families are claimed to be descendants of Odin, which is Woden or Wednesday. Kind of funny to be descended from a god, eh? So, and then you go to the months. Janus is January. February was kind of an calendar. Every year you could add days or whatever to February. It was a month of purification. You got Mars for March, Aphrodite for April, Maya for May, Juno for June. This is an interesting slide here. Julius was the first to reform the calendar, and so he named July after himself. And August was named after Augustus, who did it again after Julius didn't do it good enough. September, heptagon is 7. It's kind of like sept, sept. So it's the 7th month, even though it's the 9th month. October is the 8th month. Nov, like nonagon, 9th month. And December is 10th month, even though it should be 10, 11, 12. July and August. They didn't do it right. They need to change the names too. They didn't do that. So we have the history of it. The original Roman year had 10 named months. Martius, and probably 2 unnamed months in the dead of winter. The year began with Martius, which is March, and Numa Pompilius, and the second king of Rome, circa 700 BC, added January and February. After Februarius, there was occasionally an additional month of intercalendar. This is the origin of the leap year, day being in February. In 46 BC, Julius reformed the Roman calendar, named July after himself. When Augustus Caesar completed the calendar, he renamed August after himself. All right, there are hundreds of examples where paganism remained in our language. We use a lot of different words that stem back to paganism, like the ocean from Oceanus, and Atlantic from Atlas. Actually, Atlantis as well is from Atlas, who was supposed to be the founder of the Atlantis nation. Europe was from Europa, the wife of Zeus. Erotic is a word we use, comes from Eros, the god of romance. Hero, this is a little bit more, couldn't figure this out on your own, but it's akin to Hera, which means protector. And Hercules, which was the son of Hera, was the hero. Hel was a Norse goddess of the dead, and Saga was a goddess of poetry, and a Fate is a Greek goddess who cuts life strings. We use all these words in normal conversation. So these different cultures all had the gods that were very similar. Similarities between abilities lineage. Sometimes you have the same father and son, or the same ideas about their characters and things. Zeus was Jupiter or Jove. They're almost identical in Roman and Greek. And in Norse, Thor or Odin are slightly different than the other two, but very similar too. Thor is not the same as Odin. So we're putting two up there because they kind of split character traits from the others. We've got Cronus, which was Saturn in Roman, or Tyr in Norse. Hera was the same as Juno. And Sif or Frigga, and Eros was a male, and Cupid was a male in the Greek and Roman. But Freya was a female who had a lot of the same character traits. So they're not exactly the same, but they're very, very similar. And you got Greek and Roman, even the same name for Apollo. And then you have the Norse god for the sun, which is Sol, and Dagger, which had a lot of the same traits. You got the god of the sea, Poseidon, who was Neptune, and I don't know how to pronounce that. Njord, or something. And I think it's very interesting that all three of these have three faiths. We got three different pagan religions, all with three faiths. The relationships that can be drawn between the Greek and Roman myths can also be drawn for Egyptian and Babylonian myths, which I didn't do because it would take too much time. The further you go in the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean, the more differences in the mythology. No matter how far you go, there's always some form of mythology everywhere. So here's a question. If the gods in one culture borrowed from the older culture, why didn't they retain the name as evident in Saturn's day, which is the Roman to the Norse? Because our days of the week are Norse gods. Or Apollo, which from Greek to Roman. Or Hercules, which is the Roman name for Hercules, which is the Greek name. Well, it's clear to me that the myths existed before the languages diverged. And I'm not the only one that sees this as true. I got this from some historian on sacred text. It says, it used to be customary to account for the similarities manifested by the various mother goddesses by assuming that there was a constant cultural contact between separate nationalities, and as a result, a not inconsiderable amount of religious borrowing. Greece was supposed to have received its great goddess from the Western Semites, who had come under the spell of Babylonian religion. Archaeological evidence, however, tends to disprove this theory. The most recent researches into Mesopotamian history, writes Dr. Fornell, established with certainty the conclusion that there is no direct political contact possible between the powers of the Valley of the Euphrates and the western shores of the Aegean in the 2nd millennium BC. In fact, between the nascent Hellas, which is Greece, and the great world of Mesopotamia, which is Babylon, there are more powerful, possibly independent strata of culture interposing. And I'd also like to point out that these guys spoke different languages. And that's kind of a big barrier when you're changing a whole culture. Let's move on to some flood histories. These are all the way across the world. Paganism is everywhere, and these flood stories are everywhere with the paganism. See, here's a nation that's close to Israel, which is Assyria. And I'll read that to you. The gods, led by Enlil, agreed to cleanse the earth from an overpopulated humanity. But Utnapishtim was warned by the god Ea in a dream. He had some craftsmen build a large boat, 1 acre in area, 7 decks, in a week. Then he loaded it with his family, the craftsmen, and the seed of all living creatures. And the waters of the abyss rose up, and it formed a storm for 6 days. Even the gods were frightened by the flood's fury. Upon seeing all the people killed, the gods repented and wept, and the waters covered everything but the top of Mount Nasur, which I looked up, and it's kind of right next to Mount Ararat, where the boats landed. And 7 days later, Utnapishtim released a dove, but it returned finding nowhere else to land. He next returned a sparrow, which was also returned, and then a raven, which did not return. Thus he knew the waters had receded enough for the people to emerge. Utnapishtim made a sacrifice to the gods. He and his wife were given immortality and lived at the end of the earth.